medieval peasant kneels beside a village well in 1348. The water is brown, thick with sewage, and crawling with intestinal worms visible to the naked eye. She knows this water killed her neighbor's children last month. She knows it carries the stench of rotting corpses from the plague pit upstream. She fills her bucket anyway because she has no choice. Within hours, bloody diarrhea will tear through her intestines. She will die in agony, and her family will drink from the same well tomorrow. For over 1,000 years, medieval Europeans drank water that was essentially liquid death. They didn't drink it because they were ignorant. They drank it because clean water was more valuable than gold, and most people couldn't afford to stay alive any other way. The average medieval peasant consumed water contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, industrial runoff, and diseases that could kill entire villages in weeks. Today, you'll discover why medieval water supplies were deliberately poisoned by the people who depended on them, how entire cities became death traps built around contaminated rivers, and the horrifying truth about what happened to people who had no choice but to drink liquid sewage. This isn't just about poor sanitation, it's about a civilization that knowingly poisoned itself to survive, and the brutal consequences that followed. Medieval cities had one simple solution for human waste: dump it in the drinking water. Every major European city was built around a river, and that river served as both the primary water source and the primary sewer. London dumped waste directly into the Thames. Paris used the Seine as an open toilet. Cologne turned the Rhine into a flowing cesspit that poisoned communities for hundreds of miles downstream. The system was intentional. City planners didn't accidentally create water supplies that mixed sewage with drinking water. They designed them that way. It was cheaper than building separate systems. Waste flowed downhill into rivers. Rivers provided water for drinking and cooking. And the cycle continued until everyone downstream was drinking the concentrated waste of everyone upstream. Medieval records show that cities produced roughly 40 pounds of human waste per person per day when you included urine, feces, and household garbage. London's population of 80,000 generated over 3 million pounds of waste daily, all flowing directly into the river that supplied the city's drinking water. Village wells were death traps disguised as water sources. Medieval communities built their wells in the center of town, surrounded by houses, workshops, and graveyards. Human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff seeped through the soil directly into the groundwater that fed these wells. The well that provided a village's drinking water was often less than 50 feet from the cesspit that collected the village's waste. The contamination was visible. Medieval well water was frequently brown, green, or black. It contained chunks of organic matter, floating debris, and living organisms that moved through the water. People could see intestinal worms swimming in their drinking water. They could smell the stench of decomposition. They drank it anyway. Well, poisoning wasn't just accidental. During conflicts, armies would deliberately contaminate enemy water supplies by dumping animal carcasses, human corpses, and barrels of waste directly into wells. The practice was so common that military manuals included specific instructions for poisoning water sources to maximize enemy casualties. Medieval guilds maintained official well poisoners, specialists whose job was to contaminate water supplies during wartime. These weren't desperate measures during siege warfare. They were standard military tactics used throughout medieval Europe. Medieval industry used rivers and wells as dumping grounds for toxic waste that made sewage contamination look harmless. Tanneries dumped mercury, lead, and arsenic-based chemicals directly into water supplies. Metal workers released acids, heavy metals, and poisonous compounds into rivers that flowed through residential areas. Textile producers discharged dyes, bleaches, and chemical treatments that turned entire waterways into toxic streams. The contamination was concentrated. Medieval cities clustered industries along riverbanks to take advantage of water power and easy waste disposal. A single stretch of river might receive runoff from leather tanneries, metal foundries, textile mills, and slaughterhouses, creating a chemical cocktail that was lethal in small doses. Miners diverted poisoned groundwater directly into drinking supplies. Medieval mining operations used mercury and lead-based compounds to extract metals from ore. The contaminated water was simply redirected into the nearest river or well, carrying concentrations of heavy metals that caused neurological damage, organ failure, and death. The most deadly contamination came from alchemists and early chemists who dumped experimental compounds into water supplies. These weren't accidental spills. They were deliberate disposal methods for substances too dangerous to store but too valuable to waste. Medieval water supplies became testing grounds for chemical weapons that wouldn't be perfected until centuries later. Medieval water supplies were deliberately contaminated with human corpses. Cities dumped bodies directly into rivers during plague outbreaks, turning drinking water into a soup of decomposing flesh and disease. The practice wasn't limited to emergency situations. It was standard procedure for disposing of criminals, paupers, and anyone who died without family to pay for burial. London's Thames received over 200 corpses per day during normal periods and thousands during plague years. The bodies weren't just tossed in. They were weighted down with stones to keep them submerged in the areas where people drew drinking water. City officials believed that corpses would decompose faster underwater, reducing the stench and visible contamination. The decomposition process poisoned water supplies for miles downstream. Human corpses release bacteria, parasites, and toxins that remain active for months after death. A single corpse could contaminate thousands of gallons of drinking water with cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and plague bacteria. Mass graves routinely overflowed into groundwater supplies. Medieval cemeteries were essentially poison factories, leaching decomposition byproducts directly into the wells that supplied surrounding communities. The practice was so common that many villages built their wells inside cemetery boundaries, believing that proximity to consecrated ground would purify the water. Medieval butchers and farmers used water supplies as disposal sites for animal waste, blood, and carcasses that created contamination levels that exceeded human waste by orders of magnitude. Slaughterhouses built directly over rivers dumped entrails, blood, diseased organs, and entire carcasses into the water that communities used for drinking and cooking. The volume was staggering. A single medieval slaughterhouse processed hundreds of animals per day, generating thousands of pounds of organic waste that flowed directly into water supplies. The blood alone was enough to turn rivers red for miles downstream, creating a visual reminder of the contamination that people were drinking. Diseased animals were specifically dumped into water supplies. Medieval farmers knew that sick livestock would contaminate food supplies, so they disposed of diseased cattle, pigs, and sheep by dumping them into rivers and wells. This practice guaranteed that diseases like anthrax, tuberculosis, and brucellosis would spread through water supplies to human populations. Dead horses were particular sources of contamination. Medieval warfare and transportation killed thousands of horses, and their massive carcasses were routinely dumped into rivers because burial was impractical. A single horse carcass could contaminate miles of river water with enough bacteria to kill entire communities. Medieval leper colonies were deliberately built around contaminated water sources, creating reservoirs of disease that infected entire regions through shared water supplies. Lepers weren't just isolated. They were placed in locations where their waste and contamination would flow directly into water sources used by surrounding communities. The practice was intentional. Medieval authorities believed that concentrating lepers around specific water sources would contain the disease, but the opposite occurred. Leprosy bacteria contaminated wells and rivers, spreading the disease to previously healthy populations downstream. Leper hospitals dumped bandages, medical waste, and human remains directly into water supplies. The contaminated materials carried not just leprosy bacteria, but secondary infections, parasites, and diseases that spread through water contact. Communities that drew water downstream from leper colonies face infection rates that approach 100%. The most horrifying aspect was the deliberate nature of contamination. Medieval medical texts specifically recommended using contaminated water from leper colonies as treatment for various diseases, believing that exposure to leprosy would cure other conditions. Healthy people were encouraged to drink water that had been deliberately contaminated with leprosy bacteria. During the Black Death, medieval communities turned their water supplies into plague reservoirs by dumping infected corpses, contaminated materials, and medical waste directly into drinking water sources. Cities couldn't dispose of bodies fast enough, so they used rivers and wells as mass graves that continued to poison survivors for years after the initial outbreak. The scale was unprecedented. During peak plague years, cities like London and Paris dumped over 1,000 plague victims per day into their primary water sources. The Thames and Seine became flowing plague factories, carrying infected materials to communities hundreds of miles away. Plague doctors dumped their contaminated equipment directly into water supplies. Medieval medical practitioners used primitive protective equipment that became saturated with plague bacteria. Rather than attempting to clean or destroy this equipment, they simply threw it into the nearest river or well, contaminating water supplies with concentrated plague bacteria. The most deadly practice was using plague houses as water sources. Buildings where plague victims died were often converted into wells by simply filling the basement with water and allowing people to draw from contaminated sources. These improvised wells were essentially plague incubators, maintaining active bacteria populations for decades after the original outbreak. Medieval communities developed a thriving economy based on selling contaminated water to neighboring regions. Cities upstream sold their waste-contaminated water to downstream communities at premium prices during droughts and shortages. The practice created a marketplace where liquid death was a valuable commodity. Water merchants specialized in contaminated supplies. They transported barrels of waste-filled water from cities to rural communities, marketing it as premium water from urban sources. Rural populations paid higher prices for water that was more contaminated than anything they could produce locally. The poison trade extended to international commerce. Medieval shipping routes included water as cargo, transporting contaminated supplies between countries and spreading diseases across continents. Ships carried barrels of plague-contaminated water as drinking supplies for passengers and crew, creating floating plague ships that infected ports throughout Europe. Professional poisoners operated legitimate businesses selling contaminated water for specific purposes. These weren't assassins. They were merchants who sold different types of contaminated water for different uses. Some specialized in waters contaminated with specific diseases, others in waters poisoned with particular chemicals or metals. Medieval churches and monasteries were among the worst water contaminators, using their religious authority to justify practices that poison entire communities. Monastery brewing operations dumped waste directly into village water supplies, believing that religious institutions were exempt from contamination concerns. Church burial practices created massive groundwater contamination. Medieval churches buried bodies in mass graves directly beneath and around church buildings, with the contaminated groundwater flowing directly into community wells. The practice was justified by religious belief that consecrated ground would purify contaminated water. Holy water was often the most contaminated water available. Medieval churches collected holy water from sources that received runoff from graveyards, hospitals, and waste disposal sites. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to drink water that was more contaminated than anything available in their home communities. Religious festivals created massive temporary contamination. Medieval pilgrimages brought thousands of people to small communities with limited water supplies, overwhelming local sanitation and creating contamination spikes that killed local populations long after the pilgrims departed. Medieval children died from water contamination at rates that approached 70% in urban areas. Infants who survived childbirth faced immediate exposure to contaminated water through baptism, feeding, and daily care. Most died within their first year from diseases transmitted through contaminated water supplies. The baptism process was particularly deadly. Medieval churches used the same baptismal water for dozens of infants, creating concentrated disease reservoirs that guaranteed infection. Children who survived their own baptism often died from diseases transmitted by previously baptized infants. Wet nurses unknowingly killed the children they cared for by feeding them contaminated water. Medieval child-rearing practices required supplementing breast milk with water from local sources, exposing infants to the full range of waterborne diseases. Wealthy families who could afford wet nurses often suffered higher child mortality rates because they used more contaminated water sources. School water supplies were death traps that killed children faster than disease or accidents. Medieval schools built around communal wells that served dozens of children simultaneously, creating perfect conditions for spreading waterborne diseases through entire student populations. But that was nothing compared to what came next. Medieval populations developed partial immunity to water contamination through constant exposure, creating a survival paradox where people who left contaminated areas often died when exposed to cleaner water sources. Travelers who ventured outside their home regions frequently died from drinking water that was actually cleaner than what they were accustomed to. The immunity was specific to local contamination. Medieval communities developed resistance to the particular combination of diseases, chemicals, and toxins in their local water supply, but this resistance didn't transfer to different types of contamination. Moving to a new area often meant exposure to unfamiliar contaminants that could be fatal. Military campaigns failed because soldiers couldn't adapt to different water contamination. Medieval armies routinely suffered higher casualties from drinking local water than from combat. Soldiers who survived years of drinking contaminated water in their home regions died within days of drinking differently contaminated water in enemy territory. The most successful medieval communities were those that managed their contamination rather than eliminating it. Villages that maintained consistent levels of specific contaminants had higher survival rates than communities that attempted to clean their water supplies because sudden changes in contamination levels killed people who had adapted to consistent poison exposure.
And here's the part no one talks about.
Medieval nobility and wealthy merchants didn't drink the same contaminated water as peasants. They created elaborate systems to import clean water while ensuring that contaminated supplies remained available for the poor. The wealthy used their economic power to monopolize clean water sources while maintaining contaminated supplies for workers and peasants. Noble households employed professional water tasters whose job was to test water for contamination before consumption. These tasters were usually servants or slaves who were considered expendable. They drank potentially contaminated water and waited for symptoms before the water was served to wealthy households. The Catholic Church maintained private water supplies for clergy while blessing contaminated water for peasant consumption. Monastery brewing operations used clean water for beer production while dumping waste into public water supplies. Church officials drank imported water while encouraging peasants to accept contamination as divine will. Merchant guilds controlled access to clean water sources, creating artificial scarcity that drove up prices and forced the poor to use contaminated alternatives. Clean water became a luxury commodity available only to those who could afford premium prices, while contaminated water remained the only option for survival. Medieval peasants drank water that could kill them because clean water was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, and contaminated water was the only alternative to death by dehydration. They built their entire civilization around water sources they knew were poisoned, developed immunity to contamination that would kill modern humans in hours, and created elaborate systems to manage liquid death as a daily necessity. For 1,000 years, Europeans survived by drinking water that was essentially sewage, and most of them died from it anyway. The next time you turn on a tap, remember that clean water isn't a basic human right. It's a modern miracle that most of human history lived without.